Thank you, everyone, for being here on the eve of White House Correspondents Association dinner, aka Nerd Prom, for those of us who affectionately live here. My name is Alexis Williams. I'm Chief Corporate Affairs Officer here at Stagwell, and it's a real pleasure and honor to see so many friendly but also new faces in the room today. For a little bit of context, Stagwell is a network of over 70 agencies with 13,000 employees that works across 4 main disciplines. That's 3 big numbers in a very quick succession, but we have agencies that work across communications and public relations, digital transformation, creative, and then paid media. Zooming into today and why we're here, one of the initiatives we're most proud of is the Future of News Initiative. Launched in May of 2024, the goal of this platform was to spark a broader conversation about the importance of news as a vehicle to drive business results, but also, of course, as a beacon and pillar of our democracy. So with that, we have some amazing conversations lined up today. When we started this initiative, what really was the root of it and the genesis is we saw this increasing pull away in the marketing industry, especially from news, because of this notion of brand safety, that adjacency of brands to controversial news content was politically bad and then would have negative impacts on your brand. We've surveyed 100,000 people globally and universally found that not only is investing in news great for your brand, it's well received by some of the most influential and important consumers out there. So that really brings us to the moment today. Today we have 2 amazing panels. We're going to have a conversation first about what's consumption like now? What are people engaging with? What formats do they like? Where do they get their news? How are they thinking about the news? And even really, what is news? So we'll start there to sort of get a scene setter and landscape. Then from there, we have some incredible business leaders who are going to talk about innovation in news. We've heard so much about the journalistic coverage, the importance of editorial, and that's incredible. It's also really important that news is building a thriving business. And we have some people who have established incredible brands, but are on the legacy of on the future of what's next for news media. How are we thinking about audience? How are we thinking about technology? How are we thinking about product? And how are we doing that in a way that sets us up for a really vibrant future? So it should be a really great morning, a really great kickoff to, well, I guess the weekend kind of kicked off on Monday, but a kickoff to this day. And so we're so appreciative for your time. We also are going to have the opportunity for questions and answers throughout the panels. So start thinking of your questions now. We'll have mics coming around. And without that, and without further ado, I want to bring our first panel up. Jay Leveton, who's the president of Stagwell, will be moderating. And we have 3 incredible panelists, if you guys want to make your way. We've got Zac Moffatt, CEO of Targeted Victory, Doug Thornell, CEO of SKDK, and Giles, managing partner at Code and Theory, working in the publishing division. So with that, over to you, Jay.
Thank you, Alexis. And thank you all for coming. As Alexis said, I'm the president of Stagwell and one of the original employees from 10 years ago, and we've gone from about 0 people to about 12,000 in about 10 years, so it's been a bit of work. But one of the things we're most proud of at Stagwell is this Future of News initiative and supporting the news industry. Mark Penn, my business partner, we've been in DC a long time, and obviously working with news and the media has been something that's ingrained in our lives and these people's lives here, and they're going to talk about news and the future of it. And I think we've spent a lot of time, we do a lot of survey research in our industry and our business, and I think what you can't get away is the data about news and about the media is, you know, when you think about our country today, 25% of people say they're news junkies. And what we've seen in the industry is there's been this a lot of monetization around sports. Obviously, people like to watch the NFL. It is live TV today. But there's 25% of people today are news junkies, and they read 6 stories and articles a day. And who are these people? They're high influence, high income people. They make over $100,000 a year. You know, and CEOs of companies say this is important to support news and to target these people if you're a marketer. So, and as do CMOs. So I think what we want to talk about today, actually, one last thing I'll say about our commitment. We've announced in the last couple of weeks a 22% increase in spending on news as part of the $5 to $7 billion that we spend on media. So we are committing to working with our clients to support higher spend in the news industry. We'll say that in front of the CEOs of our next panel. But we are, and I'm sure we'll get phone calls, but we are committed to a 22% increase in our spend to news because we are going to put the money where our mouth is as well. So I think that's super important as part of this initiative and this effort. But importantly for this conversation, we really want to focus on 4 key things. So how brands and platforms should be navigating today's media landscape. Some of you are brand side, some of you are media, but I think on the brands, are interested to hear from them. Innovations in the industry, how news reaches certain audiences, and then what's next for the future of news in general. And so we have a really exciting panel. I have Giles, Managing Director in the publishing and media section at Code and Theory, which has really worked in over almost 100 newsrooms, helping them figure out the business transformation of news. Doug Thornell, the CEO of SKDK, one of the most prominent Democratic public affairs and political firms in DC, and Zac Moffatt on the other side of the aisle, Targeted Victory, also one of the most prominent political and public affairs Republican firms here in DC. And so I know this is the Oscar weekend of DC, and so I'm not going to ask you what you're wearing, even though, Jess, you look the best. What I'm going to ask you is what you're reading in true DC form. So not what you're wearing, but what are you reading? Because as 3 people plugged into the news industry, you wake up, I assume you probably, unfortunately, have your phone by the bed. So when you wake up in the morning, what are you reading on news? Because maybe this will give a sense of what people like you are engaging in what you're reading in news today.
Ladies first, I
guess
suppose.
so.
Good morning. I have to admit, and I hesitate to do so in this particular room, but I have triggered an automatic AI digest to text me a quick summary every morning of sort of customized news for me. And then I do a human crawl of favorite sources to read more deeply. And then the third thing I do every morning is once I've framed the facts, I log into TikTok to see how they're being talked about. I feel like you can't be in the news without watching how your audience is watching your news now. And so that's a really important piece, I think, of the whole landscape.
Okay, so AP Newswire, I'll look at that. There's probably 2 or 3 tip sheets, Punchbowl, Axios, Playbook that I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll skim them to see if there's anything that's relevant to what we're doing. When I get into my car, I'll probably listen to a little bit of the Daily on the New York Times, Sports Junkies, WTOP, and yeah, I mean, I think that's about it. I think it's fragmented, like everyone else.
It's not Dan Rather at 6 o'clock.
No.
Is that what you're saying? Okay.
No, look, I'm a little bit more. I mean, I jump onto X and see what I've missed. I think the problem is when you're jobs like us, you live in the matrix, so you kind of go to bed with it and you wake up with it. I do look at the publications in the morning mostly to see what other people are going to be talking about because it tends to drive the incoming I get more than what I have to think about. So I'm always kind of thinking about that, and I think that's what's interesting with all these groups is like, you get with the White House and you get with others. I'm more interested in how they're ingesting, right? What's coming through, how it is, and now with this new world with like, if AI is actually rolling things up, what's getting lost? Because a lot of times we fight so hard to get quotes into a piece, and it might just get completely stripped out. So now trying to think through the reframing of the entire piece. So that's a lot of what I'm driving. And then I get the luxury of, if something bad happens, or good, but mostly bad, I just get 50 texts. So like it's just inundated somewhere in there.
So let me stick with Zac because I know obviously new administration, 100 days. You tend to be you're on that side of the aisle. So there's been changes in the White House news news briefing room. Talk to us about that and sort of how can we think about sort of their approach to news today?
Yeah, I think when we talk to brands, I think brands still have a hard time that they still think in many ways it's 24 and they're not sure what they should do, as if the decision hasn't been made. Like someone won, there's a new administration in, and you have to get in front of them. And so if that's your goal, I think there's still a massive amount of hesitation to understand how to use new and emerging platforms. And so I think that there's still a massive role for the big publications, but I'm shocked by people's unwillingness to realize that different publications actually reach specific admin people in a way that others don't. And so there's this massive disconnect still with a lot of our brands of understanding like, why is the briefing room being shook up a little bit? What does it look like when you have these groups come in? And so we find a lot of hesitation still at the brand level to acknowledge that they're worried about internal pushback often with which publications they should be, and I think that's a misreading. I think it should be an all of the above, but there's a reallocation of who gets what and then how you pitch it. I think that there's still a very formulaic kind of approach of what used to work, and we're seeing that people are unwilling sometimes to realize that the administration's looking for certain angles in, and so that's still what we see a lot of our brands hesitating with, is the emergence of new publications that are more front and center if you're admin focused or public affairs focused, but also the framing of the conversation. How do I engage in this and what does it look like? And so I think my recommendation to anyone is to acknowledge that the way that it was is definitely disconnected from what is. And now you can't just focus and anchor off podcasts. It's like, well, it was a podcast selection. I'm going to get my CEO on Joe Rogan. Like, that is the dumbest thing I could possibly think of, right? You're not interesting. They're not going to put you on for 3 hours and you wouldn't survive. Like, the people who go on there and thrive are really good. Most of your people should not be on there. So do not think you should be on there. But that doesn't mean there aren't niche audiences you should be in front of. And whether that's a Substack that impacts what commerce is doing, or whether that's something more profound and you're looking at a higher level of how you're thinking about what your role is going to be vis-a-vis China, you have to be so much more thoughtful. And so this idea that we have to be binary, like we have no plan or we have Joe Rogan, that is the same thing. You have no plan. So now let's sit down and work through what the structure is to think about what comes next.
So Doug, talk to me, react to that a little bit in terms of running campaigns, political campaigns. You know, Zac took it from a brand point of view, but you're running political campaigns. You know, you work for Wes Moore, one of the best, strongest up-and-coming Democrat types in today. Like, so walk us through how candidates think about this as opposed to just brands.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the question, we're often asked, you know, reach or influence. For me, the biggest thing I'm looking at is impact. And when I put together you know, a media mix strategy, you know, you're looking at your broadcast opportunities. You're obviously going to be reaching a lot of voters. How much impact are you going to be able to have with folks who are watching Wheel of Fortune or Jeopardy? Probably you're going to reach a lot of voters, but one of the things about news that I think is valuable is that, you know, you're dealing with a very attentive, engaged audience. And 2.5 times more likely to recall an ad you're running on a news platform. So you're more likely to have your content that you're creating to be shared. You're more likely to get recall. And you're actually more likely to have a call to action responded to. So I think when you're thinking about, I mean, you know, I went through my media diet in the morning. It's all over the place, right? So I agree with Zac. You kind of have to have, you can have both a reach approach where you're trying to sort of create a lot of awareness around, or at least a raise your name ID. But when you're trying to target specific voters, they're living and digesting content all over the place, and you have to have content that is contextual for all of them, that's relevant. You know, with news, you can't just be reactive. I think brands are always sort of in this place where they're reacting. They're sort of not sure whether they want to jump in, jump out. Candidates are the same way, but candidates have to be into the news cycle. So it's figuring out those opportunities, figuring out the right content, and the right media mix, because, you know, for campaigns, you know, you're dealing with generally limited budgets, and you got to figure out how you can reach those 18 to 35 folks who are on TikTok. You can't do that through advertising because you can't advertise on TikTok, but you can use influencers to do that. And then you've also got, you know, your 50 to 65 voters that you know are going to turn on. And so you can, and they're still getting their content from local newspapers and from the local news. So you got to be I think you have to be very strategic, sophisticated, and also not let the you know, what happened 2 or 4 years ago inform what you're going to do this year.
So thanks, Doug. So on that vein, you know, obviously, I think both of Zac and Doug laid out sort of a large amount of disruption and diffusion. You know, someone's okay, let's do Joe Rogan. Okay, let's do TikTok, or let's do this. So what are the innovations that in platforms? How are they responding? What are the innovations that you're seeing as someone who's behind the business or working with the business teams and news? Obviously, it's a very attentive group, but you know, what's the best way to sort of get to them nowadays, and what's the technology that you're seeing in platforms responding?
To say that there's been a big shift in the relationship between platforms and publishers is obvious. I, until recently, was the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan, and on that side, you know, worked very closely with platforms like Facebook to drive traffic to my brand. And I think, we're seeing some interesting innovation come out of platforms that is dictating a lot of what media brands are needing to do as a result. I've started to think about the product roadmap of a platform as page 2 of the product roadmap for any media brand, because the decisions that they make are so deep and wide in terms of their impact on the content that we then put out. But so I think a number of innovations are really driving change in our landscape. The first is the dominance of short form vertical video and highly customized algorithms that surface content to you. It's been really stunning to see the ways that those two features have been really embraced by consumers, particularly young consumers. I'm sure you all have seen in all the discussion about losing TikTok that there's been real advocacy among users for maintaining their personal customized algorithm. It's a relationship that they have with an entity, which is really interesting. But we're also seeing some other innovations on the platform side that we should think about. One is narrowing down the spray everything everywhere algorithm to more specific algorithms like the STEM feed that we're seeing on TikTok. Narrowing down like that, of course, allows you to boost signal and build community, which is a very important thing to do. But I think critically, we all need to stop thinking of platforms as pipelines to distribute content, and to start thinking of them less as landlords and more as labs for R&D. Great spaces for you to experiment. They're a safe sandbox, test things there, pilot new ideas, and take what works back into your O&O.
So let me go back to you, Justin. Address the elephant in the room. So AI. Okay, so can have an impact. We have a services business can be impacted by AI. How do you see AI impacting news? I think you mentioned early on, well, I use my AI feed. I'm just curious, how many of you use an AI feed for your news summaries in the morning so far? Jess, you're a
To be
early
fair,
adopter.
I know. I had to hack it together myself. I used Zapier to automate a workflow.
Okay, so I think everyone's interested in this. Go ahead.
I'll share it later. No, but I think, the way that media, that news is thinking about AI for now seems to largely be as workflow efficiency, which is totally fair, and it has a lot of value to offer us there. I think the next step and where we need to innovate is in more consumer-facing features that use AI to help create truly personalized experiences at scale. One of the unique things about news consumers, as you mentioned, is that they have incredibly high intent and they're really seeking context, right? When they come in at the top of your funnel, they're coming in with a question they think they can't Google, which is, how does this news impact me? What does this mean for me? And so they're seeking that context always. And the thing that they do, and why, some older, slower, less nimble news outlets may struggle to really evolve, is that the user rewards whatever brand can close that gap the fastest. The gap of, what does this mean for me? And a really powerful way that we can think about employing AI is inside our content worlds, answering that question specifically for each consumer themselves. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of excitement. Experimenting with AI, I know, is a scary sort of thing, but my advice generally, and I think the playbook that really works, is license the past, watermark the present, and prototype the future.
Okay, that's great. So let me ask one last question for everybody, and then I'll open it up, because you seem like a news crowd who have certain questions around these things. So tell me, give me something unexpected, counterintuitive in terms of how people are engaging with news today, in terms of what you guys are seeing brand leaders need to think about, sort of a last thought, and then, like I said, I'll open it up for the team.
I'll start just by saying that, to me, the comments are the content. That is the new thing that we all need to be thinking about. News, especially in 2025, 2026, and beyond, really can no longer be something that we publish once and walk away from. It has to be architected for participation and thought of as a conversational loop with your consumer. And so those participatory layers that you can add into your content do a lot to deepen engagement, to bring the really rich conversation that your consumers are having about your content on other platforms back into your own spaces. So that's one thing I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say your values as your values, whether you're a candidate, you're an organization or a company, are increasingly more and more important to consumers on the left and the right. And so I think understanding how you build a platform to be able to share what those values are through compelling storytelling that can live across, your owned, your paid, your earned, your social platforms is going to be more and more important. I think you're seeing at the candidate level and campaign level, they sort of understand that, and I think they know how to utilize a lot of these different distribution methods to reach voters. I think brands are getting there, but I think that and look, a lot of this is short form storytelling with video, but it still has to be something. I think you have to look at this as an all of the above approach versus just saying I'm going to accomplish my goal through these one or two platforms when you're just going to miss a lot of people.
Yeah, and look, I think the point to that is it's the consistent application of your worldview across all these things, but then also realizing that that doesn't mean that structurally you don't have to change where you put an emphasis. And I think that we're still overemphasizing publications or places or storytelling for the way things were. And I think there is a massive disconnect. And so like that would be the only thing that I would say is like oftentimes like I think we spend too much time fighting over like who is a news personality, who is able to distribute, as opposed to saying they have distribution. How do I engage with this? Because I have a consistent thing to say and how to apply it. And so I think that that's one of the struggles I see is that I see a lot of internal organizations structurally incapable of doing anything but pitching the way that they all were hired to do. And that's a massive blind spot because you have to be more capable of being able to drop in and out and know when's the right time. Sometimes you're going to put executives into positions where they get a little bit uncomfortable because the rules are a little bit different, but with the right briefing, the right training. But if you don't, you will be left behind. The alternative is to do nothing. And I promise you that's the single worst thing you can do.
Cool. Let me thank you guys. It was really super interesting. Let me take some questions from the crowd. Yeah, right here in the front.
What do you think about the future of ProPublica? This idea that a nonprofit group could sort of fill up the news deserts, especially in local news, where we have seen a lot of small newspapers going out of business around the country. Do you think ProPublica has any important role to play?
Let me just make sure everybody can hear the question. The question was views of ProPublica, nonprofit groups and then news organizations, and also sort of filling the desert around local news. I think I got that. Okay.
Well, I would just say, look, I think, and I think Zach and I would agree on this. I think there is a huge importance on hyper-local activity. And, I know there are publications, like I think Axios has opened, multiple different, local Axios news outlets, right? So, and I'm also a big believer in in supporting local broadcasters and news outlets because I think, it's sort of like, when you poll someone, do you like Congress? They hate it, but they like their local congressperson, right? It's sort of in some ways you see that with brands too, and so I think being able to be in local markets, and I can't speak specifically to what to your question, but I think largely my view is local news is still is a needed, necessary thing, whether you're doing it through paid or earned. Because it's still a place that people trust for their information, and it still has a reach. So investing in that is important. And look, all of it, $10 billion was spent on political advertising last cycle. $5 billion, a little bit more, was spent with local broadcasters. About $2.5 billion was spent with local news. So it's still very important. And I think we have to. I think we have to, particularly if you're a brand. I think that's a real important place to be when you're trying to reach consumers.
We also see really interesting desire signals for local news. One of which is that 30 some odd % of American adults get news at least once a month from Nextdoor, which is not considered a local news publisher, but is, of course, a local news platform. And you could see that as a redefinition of what news means to modern consumers, or you could see that as proof positive that local news is really meaningful and is something that users want to take action on.
You're good. Okay. So we span Nextdoor and Joe Rogan. Just think where we were 10 years ago. Like, look how far we've come. Yeah, right here in the front too.
Katie Purchase from the Wall Street Journal. I'm interested in understanding in the future of news space how much you think accountability and trust within the actual brand origin of news is going to be important, especially in this world of AI.
Well, I think there's a balance. I think there's always a role for it. I think that the challenge is where you're talking about it from the consumer perspective or the brand perspective, right? And who's sitting where in this kind of journey. And I think that's the ultimate challenge here. I think taking a step back, our view on the future of news is the more money that goes into it, the higher the level will be across the board. And I think that there's been this pullback over the last 4 to 8 years where brands have been scared to just be adjacent to conversations. We can't be scared of conversations that are going on. And so I think at a working theory level, we think that the more money that goes into the space, the more opportunity there is. And I think that's what we're ultimately advocating for, right? Is that there needs to be more participation. Whether we then get into who should be on these groups, because it's one of the challenges too, is like we sometimes can't bring other groups into the future of news organization because there's well, they're not a news publication. But then the conversations can't occur if you can't even have some sort of common ground. And so I think the hope for us is that we start with future of news with the publications we're working for, but eventually bring in actually more voices to get a little bit more of a surround sound to help be that bridge. So I think there's a lot of things that future of news is trying to solve. But I think that is ultimately your question is going to be what we grapple with.
And I think it's interesting to contemplate the fact that there is a generational divide. Older consumers and younger consumers define trust differently and read signals of trust differently. And so for the older half of your consumer group, they think an institution is trustworthy because it's an institution. For Gen Z, for example, which has some, let's say, institutional skepticism, they see a person as trustworthy. In a way, they're flip sides of the same coin. They see a person as trustworthy because they can develop an emotional relationship, a parasocial relationship with that person where their parents feel like, well, one person can't be fully responsible or accountable for the kind of journalistic rigor that we all expect. And so I think we're seeing really smart news organizations lean into that latter thing, lean into the personality forward work, especially on social platforms where it is really resonating and helping to bring in a new consumer set.
Yeah, actually, we'll go back. We'll come forward. Go ahead.
Jeff Dager, Politico. I'm kind of curious, we've talked a little bit about consumer political advertising, but as we think about associations and CSR, policy advertising, we've kind of seen this influence continue to get smaller, and your ability, to work with those type of clients to really have that type of impact. So like when it comes to, publications and advertising to a much smaller audience that wields an outsized influence, with whatever messaging they're trying to get to, like, what does that mean for you guys when it comes to your companies, and how do you kind of really message and work with your clients to make sure that you are hitting a much smaller group, but the group that is truly going to have the most impact when it comes to more association advocacy policy messaging?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges right now of what you're trying to actually get and what's the vehicle through which, right? We're doing a lot of bills where everything gets bundled in. So to what degree does that look like? But I think that you're right. I think the really tough questions are kind of like, I think the power comes from unleashing the budget. The money may be the same, but you have to completely think about differently how it's going to be allocated and the order in which it's allocated and what you're looking for. And I think that's what we still see people are grappling with. Like there are certain things that you're going to drive if you're in some of the newsletters or you're on some of the sites, you look into it and the framing of it. But I think right now I see that there's a real struggle that people want to talk to like certain like 100,000 plus households, and they're going to buy this. And I don't think that's where the decision making per se is. It's become far more tightly wound. But then you also have to spend almost as much time on the message into it. And I think that that's still kind of a plug and play. Like a lot of people send over like, so a lot of these big companies who do like the kind of evergreen, always on stuff, they're not saying anything. And so there's this kind of a challenge. And so I think that's what we were trying to figure out with folks is when you come in, how honest are you about what your end goal is? How honest are you about how tight you want to be against that audience? Or are you going a little broader and be a little bit bleeder? Because DC is its own unique market. And that's why you have to think of that's why I think you think of the admin as different from a major publication, as different from the consumer versus the voter. And I think that before people bundled them together a little bit more and kind of ended up in the same spot. And I feel like that's actually been the unlock this time, is getting people to really be much more honest about who they're going after and what they're willing to spend in order to talk to them.
Go ahead, yeah.
John Wardock, longtime podcast guy. Oh, I get a microphone. This is awesome. What is the future of podcasting as it relates to the future of news? Because Joe Rogan, what is it, 60 million views now? Not a journalist. So square all that for us.
Well, so half of American adults listened to a podcast in the last month, which is a big increase from prior years. It seems to me that podcasting audio is increasingly becoming the sort of like background app. The can't use your eyes, and so need to be able to hear it way to digest news. But I'll throw it to you. I'm curious.
So I'm going to come at this question from a slightly different angle. Before podcasts were a big thing and I'm training or prepping someone to go on TV or do a print interview, there are things that I would tell them to do that are entirely not applicable to podcasts now, right? In terms of it is a totally different platform and venue and format. And I think one of the things, at least from a political standpoint, politicians on the left and the right, that they've got to understand is how to actually, if you're going to do a podcast, whether that is Dax Shepard or, the Breakfast Club or Joe Rogan, whatever it may be, you can't go on there and behave like you would on TV or or a print publication as a typical politician. You are going on a podcast to be able to share aspects of your life and be authentic in a way that you can't really do in other places because you're just focused on sort of that soundbite. And I think one of the things that's going to happen with a lot of, and you see it now, Pete Buttigieg does a lot of podcasts, Wes Moore does a lot of podcasts. The president obviously did it during the campaign. There's some that work that some don't. But if you go in there with the same mindset that you go in when you're trying to do MSNBC or Fox, you're going to fail. And I think everyone's got to adapt a little bit in terms of how they actually use that platform to their desired impact. Otherwise, it's a mistake to do it.
And then, of course, podcasting is increasingly a video platform.
Right.
And video of podcast recordings has proved incredibly productive, especially in the social space. So I think if you are thinking of launching a podcast in 2025, you cannot do so without thinking of it as a video operation, not just an audio operation.
I think we have time for one more. I'm saying okay with in the back. Just yell and I'll repeat. Go ahead.
Here's another name, Stephen A. Smith. I'm just wondering what you guys think about how sports is becoming the place for news, and obviously, that's okay. There's other outlets like Las Culturistas with Bowen Yang and Matt Rogers. People listen to that and get their little piece of news from that too. So, but especially with sports, I'm just curious.
So the question is just around sports and news. Is sports news or is sports people news people? Essentially.
Well, I mean, look, sports crosses over into politics, culture. There was 3-4 weeks ago, it was the anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. So that's sports and that's news and that's politics, right? And so I think that there is an increasingly blurry line. Now, I think your sports traditionalists are going to say, look, when I turn on the sports junkies, I don't want to hear anything about Trump or Harris or anything else, right? But I think more and more folks understand that there is a little bit of a blurry line there. But I also know when I do turn on the sports junkies, or if I'm watching the NFL draft or whatever it may be, I kind of want to be in that world, right? The other stuff that I deal with, whether it's political, social, whatever it may be, I kind of like the idea of being in that, like watching the draft and not having that disrupt that moment that I have where I can just zone out and focus on football.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I guess I would think of it from one perspective, and sports is reach. So you want to be on it, right? Like that's
Right.
ultimately what we took away, what Trump's superpower was. I mean, he is the number one influencer in the world. He is interesting. He's interesting for 3 hours. You may not like everything, but he says something, and you just see a side of him. So you can't go on them if you are not interesting or funny. Like if it's going to highlight the worst of you, I would stay far away from them. You don't have to do everything, right? There's reasons that in 2012 when I worked for Governor Romney, we didn't do things that President Obama did. Like there were certain things that he would do better, certain late night shows, AMAs that we would have struggled with, and you have to be honest about that. So that's one part of it. I think your question the other way is, are the Stephen A. Smiths and the others going to come into the political world? I think that, once you're in, you don't get out. And once you pay the tax, I'm not sure that you want to be there. And so maybe they think that they are. We'll see. Very few people, just because Trump does it doesn't mean everyone else can. And I think a lot of people are going to learn that lesson very painfully. And then we'll see what it means. But it will create a new ecosystem as a result, because it will also kind of change how people consume. But I think a lot of people, they have platforms, but to the point Doug's making is like, that's not what you're signing up for, the platform. That person's going to have to pivot to another platform. But I do think sports right now, podcasts specifically as well, like they have this massive reach and the capacity for someone to go on and be human and to show a different side. And I think to talk for more than 30 minutes and start to break down your true self comes out. I think that is the underlying theory, I think, of a podcast, is someone sees eventually you cannot hide who you are. You will say something in passing. You will say something. You will give a look that will give some insight to what someone thinks about you. And that will either highlight it or it'll minimize where you can go from there.
The thing about Trump, though, is that he had a background in sports, right? He did WWF stuff. He owned a football team. There was an authenticity to him showing up at UFC fights and going to the Army Navy game and things like that. And when you look around, and you're seeing more and more politicians using sports platforms, right? Like I can tell you, Wes Moore does Junkies calls every week, right? Shapiro's been doing things, right? So again, I think it also comes back to, is it authentic to who you are, and does it make sense? Because otherwise you're going to jump on there kind of like Zach said, and it's just going to land the wrong way. And so I do think that they're big platforms. I was surprised that Joe Biden didn't do the interview before the Super Bowl a year and a half ago, because it's a huge audience. I don't know how you miss that opportunity. But it also has to be done in like the right contextual way. Otherwise, you may do more harm than good.
Okay, thank you, panel, and we'll get ready for the next.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.